Hello, hi, what's up? It's me, Karen, your favorite booktuber, and I'm back at it after a lengthy absence because I was forlorn in most of August. But today I'm back. I'm ready to conquer the internet with my July reading wrap up, and I read 11 books. It feels like so many months ago, but it was not. It was literally last month. Anyways, having said all that, the first book, oh no, that's actually, no. That's not all I wanted to say. What I did want to say, because I was thinking about this earlier in the month when I was in a slightly better mood, was that my July reading can kind of be defined by three different pillars or categories. And, you're going to have to give me some leeway here because not every book fits into these categories, but I did notice some themes. Now, okay, the first theme, the smaller theme, which encompassed two books, was looking at the West versus the East and a post-colonial landscape and considering the ways in which nations need to grapple with the idea of America and progress. The second category of books was women biographies, and that's not actually the category. I just forgot and was saying words. The actual category was biographies. I did primarily read biographies of women, and the questions that I was asking myself, and this kind of does harken back to the book that I read in June, Once Upon a Time, the Carolyn Bessette Kennedy book, and a lot of the reading that I've been doing the last few years, there's been many biographies, but anyways, the question has been, how well can you truly know someone, and what constitutes knowing? Now, the obvious answer to that is that you can't really truly know someone, and it is an interesting question to ask and consider when reading a biography because there's a lot of he said, she said, they said, and the ways in which we move in the world, so many people can have different perceptions of us, and it's just a matter of whoever got to speak to the person writing the book. And that was something that I was really grappling with in the month of July. And the third little category of my reading, the one that was in some regards more interesting, was considering women creators, artists, particularly writers in America within the context of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So in the 30s, we had, I believe, I wrote these dates down. So whatever dates I gave you were completely and absolutely wrong. The dates were the 20s, 30s, and 40s because, and this is a teaser as to what I was reading and who I was reading about in the month of July, I read about Connie Converse, who was born in 1924, Joan Didion, 1934, Sylvia Plath, 1932, and Eve Babitz, 1943. Now, it is interesting to consider the ways in which society affected these women's capabilities to create art and also live a life true to themselves. And it seems quite challenging. And I would say that it was also considering the ways in which women artists exist in America was like this theme. It was also one that I recognized because these women are all white was really narrow of a way to view being a woman artist, but it was just something I realized, like unbeknownst to me, I was reading about women one decade after the other who were artists living in America and struggling at times. Anyways, that's a lot of preamble. Please bear with me. I've just forgotten how to do this whole thing. Anyways, the first book that I read was Guard Your Daughters by Diana Tutton. This is a Penelope Persephone edition of the book, and they're nice books to hold and read, but the covers aren't as, you don't know what this is. And I guess you could say that's the same problem with Fitz books, that the covers in their uniformity do not reveal to the reader anything. But having said that, and I'll probably include a few little former covers because I think it'll be interesting to look at those. So Guard Your Daughters is a story of 5 sisters, and I think you can say that this is a darker Pride and Prejudice, Little Women situation. You have 5 unique, precious girls who are living in the rural English countryside with their eccentric father and mother. Their father is a murder mystery writer, and the mother is a homemaker. Now, why this book is darker than the two previous quite lauded, quite well-known books about female sisters is because there is this undercurrent of darkness, and it starts off quite early. So our narrator is the middle sister. Her name is Morgan. All of the sisters, except for the youngest, who has a boring name, Teresa, they all have these names that harken to British history and that have kind of a darker undercurrent, like Morgan Le Fay, etc. And so they're all quite artistic. And then at the very, very beginning, what we learn, because the eldest sister, who has just been married, returns home, and she says to Morgan, when they're off on a walk, that she recently visited a doctor, and he said that all was okay. And it was quite reassuring for her to hear this, because one worries. And that is like the first kernel of doubt that we have that something is different in this family. And as we're progressing along, we're kind of getting to understand this tightrope that the family is navigating, in which everything is done in order to appease the mother and keep her happy. And we hear from the narrator how her mother is so beautiful in her own special way, but they all fear upsetting her nerves. And as the novel progresses, we end up finding more. And I would say that maybe you could be like, it's not necessarily that dark. Totally, for sure. But it is interesting to consider that, the ways in which the relationship to the mother affects these children so much. And I think that if you read that book, the book about the space goat, you know what I'm talking about, it's super popular. There's like, that book and this book are in dialogue, and they're kind of exploring the same way, in which one character is the glue of the family, especially in a dysfunctional family. However, I would say that there is a lot of levity in this book, as the narrator points out in the very first opening page, when she says that when I moved to London, everyone was just like, oh, you must have had such a boring upbringing and such a boring life in the countryside. And she was like, no way. We got up to a lot of shenanigans, and we read some of them. We see the ways in which Morgan and the youngest daughter, Teresa, are engaging in these escapades. At one point, Teresa has to take French lessons, and this causes a bit of an upset, and the girls are all trying to find men to get married. And there's this interesting scene in which Morgan befriends one of their neighbors and is brought over to their house, and at first she's kind of like excited by this young girl, but then she realizes she has bad manners and she gets mad at her and whatever. It's an interesting book. I really had a good time with this one. The next book that I read was Bad Lawyer by Anna Dorn. This is her memoir, but I would preface by saying that this is mostly focused on her experience in law school, being a practicing lawyer, and then also her pivot towards fulfilling her vocation, becoming an author. And it's very funny. I would say that if you have read Vagabond, don't read them in close vicinity. Give them a wide berth. That's the right word, right? I don't know. Anyways, I would say what I really appreciate about this is that Anna Dorn is so like crystal clear on the whole process of law school and being a lawyer. She's not enamored with it. She's not one of those people who's like, it was so hard, my life is so hard, we're so busy, which is a thing that a lot of people suffer from. And the reality is, it's like, it's not that bad. And I really do empathize with how she's just like unfussy about that. She's just like, it was great, it wasn't that hard. There are other things that are harder, and I really appreciate that personally. Anyways, very humorous, very similar to Vagabond, which was her debut novel, and would recommend that for sure. I mean, I would recommend Bad Lawyer as well, but I do think that if you're someone who's really enamored by law, don't read it, because one of the key things that Anna Dorn is really doing is showing the ways in which we as a society really venerate the law, and we hold it like up there, and we're like, the law. But she's kind of just like, you have to be cognizant of the fact that the law is really these rules that we put into place, or that have been in place for a long time, might not necessarily be beneficial for society at large, or for those who are less privileged. Oh my God, there's also a really good anecdote about how her mother got arrested. It is so funny. The next book that I read was B as in Beirut. Now, this is an interesting book to discuss. It is told in 4 parts, so I guess you could almost say that they are short stories, but I would not even really say that, because a short story, often the ones that we really like are ones that are very contained and exacting. These are not. These are wild and uninhibited, because what connects these four stories is that they are tales of four women living in the same apartment building in Beirut during the Civil War, and you are seeing the ways in which, I don't know why I'm holding this still. You're seeing the ways in which time is moving backward and forward. They are really mired in the trauma and stress of dealing with the realities of war every single day. You have one character, the first one, I think her name is Maha. Her name's Lillian, and she is, in the very, very first pages, you find out that she is packing and unpacking her suitcase because she has a desire to flee. She wants to leave, but her husband does not want to leave. Her husband, who suffered an injury and is now handicapped, is really obstinate in his desire to stay, but is also lost the will to live almost. He is not the man that she married, and you see how she is fighting with the battle within to flee, to stay. There's this like sense of like a frenzy. Then you have another story of a woman, her young daughter disappeared, and she's gone mad because she is unable to cope with this. She thinks her daughter will come back. And then you have another woman who does go abroad but is unable to stay abroad. She feels very unsettled, so when she returns, she gets mired into the scene. She's helping a few of her friends make a documentary, but she loses the spark that is her. And there are moments where the writing is like really wow. Obviously you can tell I tabbed it. I've gotten into tabbing. We are now a tabber, and let me read something. Okay, so what I'm going to be reading, this is a funeral scene. Page 200. Bodies moved, bent, groaned, burned up, suffered. The sound of choked screams, of loud screaming, crying, weeping, then silence. Mundials flew from the women's hair, their shiny hair styled precisely. Some were brunettes, some let a little gray adorn their once raven hair. His mother's body bent, my body bent, screamed, moaned, hurt. I placed my hand on my stomach. My son, she said, I weep for the child I never had. There wasn't a soul who didn't recognize the Zame's face and voice. Everyone knew him. Their heads seemed long after the thin white mundials had fallen to their shoulders. Some tried to pull the mundials back up, but they refused to stay. After a while, the women no longer cared whether their hair could be seen, with the mundials no longer cinched around their necks. Their necks were exposed as the mundials slipped down there, sad and crooked, as though they too mourned. The women had become bound by sorrow, the common property of absence. They became the effects of death, of legend. Only the religious women maintained their grip on the mundials, kept them tight around their heads, their necks. Then I'm going to continue just a little bit further, because I think this is interesting to consider in relation to Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. Ghassan remained absent, silent, cold. Had those moments been real or a dream? He had truly gone to his death. His dreams drove him out to that open space on a scorched hill for days and nights. There, death took on another meaning. That's how he died twice. Once when he lost his life, and once when he couldn't give his death the meaning he so desired. Maybe everyone dies like that. I'm the martyr's mother, I heard his mother repeat in an absent and choked voice. And then a little later on, on page 201, every day the sun rises, only to show that there is nothing new underneath it. Yeah, the themes that I wrote in my little post-it is a lot of running, fleeing, flying, and it's just really considering the lived realities of women within this context. The next book that I read was Payne Party's Work, Sylvia Plath in New York, summer 1953. Now, as you can tell, this is a book that looks at a very, very, very specific time in Sylvia Plath's life, the summer that she came to New York to work for Mademoiselle magazine. I believe that's what it's, yeah. And she was one of the guest editors. This was a program where girls all across the country were plucked for their wonderful taste and astute writing capabilities and were brought to New York. They were living in the Barbizon and had a full day of activities planned for them by the magazine. And they all worked together to edit the college edition of the magazine. And you see the ways in which why I liked this book, and I'm going to have to say it's not for everyone once again, because it is a very, very specific, focused look on something. I liked how it showed Sylvia Plath, who is an author who so much is venerated and placed upon her life's history. We see this on the TikToks and the memes and the whole situation, but this really goes and places her at a time in her life where anything seemed possible, and we're really seeing the ways in which she placed a lot of expectations and hopes on this one summer in New York. And I honestly really understand that, because I think I've done that quite a bit in my life, where you hope and desire and yearn for something glamorous and for something wonderful to happen, and then you are disappointed when that is not what happens. And the author is really kind of also making the case that a lot of what happened that summer, she was quite overworked, because she, unlike a lot of the other girls, there was only 2 girls in this whole cohort and this whole program who were actually given like major work. And what Sylvia Plath really wanted was to do something fun and creative, but actually she, because of her intellect, was given the role of like managing editor or like assistant to the managing editor, so she was doing a lot of work. And so the author, as I was saying, was making the case that this really set the stage for her suicide attempt. We also get a lot of quotes, and I think this is another thing where this book is really wonderful, and I think it's in a way that a larger biography that is looking at the entirety of her life wouldn't give the scope to the quotes of the other women in the program. And you're seeing their like experiences, their firsthand accounts and thoughts on Sylvia Plath. And some of them were like, oh, she was really quite nice, and another one was like, oh, she was maybe a little mean or something like that. And I just think that's so interesting to see those like quotes and hear from these women. And you also kind of hear quotes about them reconciling where they saw themselves and the expectations that they had and what they wanted in this very specific time in American life, where it is 1953 and the idea of women living alone in New York is quite salacious for the country. It is something the working girl in the city really excites the nation. And then there are ways in which this nonfiction book is also a little artistic. On page 64, for example, we have a dictionary of adolescence. It starts with April, a month that exhilarated Sylvia. We get eyes. Sylvia's keen interest in and observation of others was one of her strongest qualities. She inherited her father's straightforward gaze, and her gaze was relentless. This is like very interesting and not something that one would expect. I think the author was really taking a lot of artistic liberties there. And some of the other things that we find out, we get these like little tiny factoids that are so interesting. We find the specific shade of red lipstick that Sylvia liked to wear. We find out that on page 62, we find this out. She went on 67 dates between July 1st and August 31st in the summer of 1949. And then towards the end of the book, we find out some of the inspiration of what really inspired the bell jar. There's one girl in particular who feels as if Plath took a lot from her own life and her own summer, and it's very interesting to see the ways in which she speaks of that. So those were my thoughts on this book. The next book that I read was Seasons of the Migration to the North. This is a book by a Sudanese author. This is considered a really important book in post-colonial African literature. Now, I really kind of struggled with this book because I did find it to be a little misogynistic, and it was not until I got, I think it's like, oh gosh, much further into the book, maybe like after page 78 or so, that I was really able to begin to connect the dots. Now, on one hand, that's like kind of a silly thing to say because the book is so short. It's only 139 pages. So I was struggling a little bit with this because this is a story that is told within a story, but also the story within the story is really fractured at first. So at first I was hoping we were really going to stick with that, but then we didn't. So then I had to really restructure my framework for understanding this book. And then I started to connect the dots. Which is a long way to say that this is a book about a young man who has been educated in Europe, who returns home to his small little village and encounters another man, a mysterious man, who also has a life history similar to his own, but there is a darkness in this other man. This man is someone who makes a case quite early on that he was really someone different. Not like other guys from Sudan kind of vibes, where he says that he's moved through his life without having strong connections to people, and then he made it, like, school was so easy to him. When he spoke English, people felt as if, you know, the language was made for him. The ways in which these words would come out of his mouth seemed so natural in a way that was unnatural to his fellow countrymen. So he goes to England, and while he's in England, and so I guess you could say, like, you're beginning to see this, like, hyper-individualism. Hyper-individualism also comes up in this book. I don't know if you could tell from whatever preamble I gave in the beginning, these two books were talking a lot for me. Like, they were dialoguing. Anyways, so the narrator is talking to this older guy. The older guy is talking about how when he gets to England, he really is fucking around and getting involved with lots of women. There is this idea of there being this germ of violence within himself, but also something that is a result or born from the West. And he's really trying to get to the bottom of that. And he meets his match in a woman called Jean. I think that's her name. And you're seeing their very intense relationship, and it comes to an explosive end. And the novel continues along this path of very explosive things happening, like unexpected acts of violence. And wow, oh my god, this does tie into the opening of my most recent newsletter on the Democratic Convention, what Kamala Harris was wearing. But more interestingly, the very beginning of that is speaking about violence in suburbia. And why I'm saying that is because I make a comment about how people are saying, not in my town, and something similar happens here because there is an act of violence that is committed, and it leaves a lot of people wondering, like, what's going on? Why is it that the violence has come to our village? A lot of this is also reconciling the ways in which the people who are in Sudan are talking about how, though the colonizer may have left, they have not exactly left, because they educated us and they have taught us their ways such that we are just repeating the same things and falling into their overarching desires. Then as the novel moves along, I started to see that there was also this discussion of women's rights that made me kind of understand maybe why there was a lot of misogyny in the beginning of the book. And then by the end of it, I felt as if maybe at first I was like, we could have ended this book earlier when there is an incident where the narrator, there's a fire, okay? I thought maybe that could have been the ending, but that is not the ending. Instead, the narrator is in the Nile, and that is the ending. And I thought that was such a great ending because it's kind of one of those things where I'm like trying not to spoil the end for you, but I don't really think you can spoil books at all. Like, even if you know how a book is going to end, you know how Romeo and Juliet is going to end, you still read the play, you still go and watch it. So anyways, our narrator is in the middle of the Nile, and he is held, he is at the mercy of the Nile. He is calling out for help, and kind of shows the ways in which former colonial states are also just locked into this position because of these larger players, and who can they turn to for help. So at the end of it, I was kind of just like, I see the vision, I get it. Okay. I really feel like I'm out of practice with this whole video thing. The next book that I read was Didion and Babitz by Lili and Anolik. I read this book because it was an ARC from NetGalley, and I also read this book in tandem with my good pal Nathan. I'm so happy we did that because it was really, we had a lot of fun dialogue and so much fun talking about this book. We actually did a live. It's 2 hours and 30 minutes. If you want to hear us talking about this book in depth, I would highly recommend you check it out. I kind of like don't know what to say about this book because I didn't really get along with it. Lili and Anolik is responsible for bringing Eve Babitz back into the public consciousness, and that is incredible. We love to see it. I'm getting a phone call from a number I don't know. Anyways, that number is not important to me. It's from a New York health facility. Yeah, where was I? So Lily Anolik brought Eve Babitz back into the public consciousness. She fostered a relationship with her towards the end of her life, and through that was able to glean all sorts of details and information about Eve Babitz, and wrote a biography about the woman. I think it's called either Eve's Hollywood or Hollywood's Eve. And though I have not read that book, I'm not sure if I will, because I read Didion and Babitz with a lot of expectations, and I think that's kind of a bad thing. You shouldn't have expectations, especially when it comes to reading books. But I was really hoping for a nuanced look at the relationship that Babitz and Didion had towards each other, but we don't really get that. And part of that is because Anolik is so enamored with Eve Babitz and obsessed with her, and hates Joan Didion. Like, I it's kind of wild to say that and to use language like that for me, but it seems quite clear that she harbors a lot of resentment towards Joan Didion. There are references to how one of the greatest sin that Joan Didion did was spawn copycat white women who believe they are the next best great American writer, and there's just a lot of, I don't know, I think like kind of cattiness. It was not exactly a pleasant read. The tone was really intense. I also felt that the writing style was a little bit lacking. Lily Anolik would refer to you, the person reading the book, as dear reader, and it was this refrain that would come up very often, and I found the writing to be so colloquial or just so casual, in a way that really grated me, because I think that she did, a beautiful butterfly just flew by. She did a massive disservice to both Joan Didion and Eve Babitz, because both of those women were incredible stylists in their own way. And obviously, Joan Didion was so precise with her language. Eve Babitz was so much more sensual, but these women could craft beautiful sentences. And I felt as if Lily Anolik's writing was not on par with these two incredible writers, and I think that's a really big detriment of the book. Another detriment is how much attention Anolik pays Eve Babitz. We literally find out Eve Babitz's whole entire life history. We do deep dives into who she's sleeping with, what kind of addictions she's suffering with at that particular decade. And then when it gets to Joan Didion, we don't get that same amount of depth. And if we had the crazy amount of depth for both of them, I would have been on board, but we don't. It's just so one-sided and so focused on Eve that I felt a bit frustrated. I felt as if I was just reading the original biography that she had written. And there was another point that I wanted to make. Basically, a lot of what Anolik's kind of doing is trying to show this relationship, because what we do learn is that Eve's career was aided by Joan Didion. Joan Didion helped to get her into the Rolling Stones. She edited her first book. Eve Babitz then fired her, and it seems as if their relationship naturally drifted, but it's really hard to say, because we only find out from Eve, from this letter that she didn't send, any possible kind of disagreements between the two. And my third complaint, I don't know if we're numbering these, but my third complaint would be that Anolik is really obsessed with who was sleeping with who, and this sort of like the various connections between people in the art scene, and she spends a lot of time focused on this. And there are a few times where she interviews the last or like earlier paramours of both Eve Babitz and Joan Didion, and she's chatting with these men, and these men get the last word on Joan Didion and Eve Babitz. And for that reason, I kind of just felt as if it was another insult to both of these women on top of the poor writing. And I just felt as if it's so unfair that these men get the last word. In particular, one of the guys that is interviewed is Joan Didion's boyfriend from New York, the guy that I referenced in The World According to Joan Didion when I was talking about reading that book. I think that happened in February, and how I said that one of her boyfriends called her a mouse and in a really mean capacity. So Lily Anolik interviewed this guy because he's still kicking, and he basically kind of says that he's responsible for being Joan Didion, that he was the reference for many of her male characters in her novels. For one example, Ryder Channing and Run River and a few other ones. And if it weren't for him, Joan Didion and Gregory Dunn would not have married, and that he basically highly, heavily, wildly suggested that she get with him, and that would be the right move, and that whatever. And I just think that was interesting. I just kind of wish that when she had been chatting with these guys, she gave more pushback. She really doesn't. And she speaks about it in such a way that I didn't get on with. Like, it's just so, it's like maybe fodder for a podcast, but I don't really listen to podcasts. I'm not that interested in narrative podcasts. So, all in all, it's a really roundabout way to say that if this book interests you, you should probably just pick it up from the library first. Okay? Yeah. Okay, the next book that I read was Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller. I want to do a dedicated video on this, so I'm going to try not to go too in-depth on this book. This is basically like early days autofiction. It is a story of a young American man, Henry Miller, in Paris, trying to be an artist. There's no plot, it's just vibes and kind of episodic little stories, and you're seeing the ways in which he is fucking women and living the life of almost a vagabond, just in Paris, being an artist and concerning himself with writing his novel. But as much as I'm being a little flippant, I do think that this book is considering the idea of America in a way that I find really fascinating, because obviously Henry Miller is an American living in Paris, and somehow that distance enables you to have a more objective perspective of your homeland. He says a line about how America is an abstract idea. On page 100, around there, he is relaying a little anecdote with an Indian man who was part of Gandhi's freedom movement, and speaks about how this young man is so worried about England, but really he shouldn't worry about England. He should be thinking about America, and how the burgeoning nation of India, which was not yet a nation at that time, should respond to the threat of America. And I was really quite taken with it, even though there is so much also, once again, a lot of misogyny, racism, all sorts of things. But I do feel like after page 100, it does level down a little bit, and you're able to like see the story and where we're going and the ideas that we're working with. I spoke about this book also in my newsletter and referenced how I thought this was a really layered book. From the very first page, we're seeing a Paris that is not the beautiful, glowing, like wonderful city that is Paris. Instead, we see a Paris that is filthy. That is something that Henry Miller speaks about quite often, the ways in which the city is amok with rats, lice, vermin, tapeworms, cockroaches. It's really intense. He's really laying it on thick how dirty like the modern world is. And I think part of that is to show the ways in which culture is dead and dying, and that's kind of one of the ideas that he's playing with, that, you know, if culture is dead, what are we really doing? There's references to humans working and considering the ways in which the body and humanity is just a machine almost. I don't know. I thought there was a lot to work with. I would definitely say you should check it out. The next book that I read was a nonfiction book. This was To Anyone Who Ever Asks: The Life, Music, and Mystery of Connie Converse. Now, this book is really depressing. I had to like take a break once or twice because I was on one hand so just like flabbergasted by how talented Connie Converse was, and then on the other hand I was just as equally disheartened and saddened by the fact that she never received public attention or major success, though she did touch the lives of the people she was close with. I just found that loss of talent to be so heartbreaking, because I do think it is something that even now it's obviously still happening. There are so many people in this world, so much talent that we don't get to see flourish because of the ways that society moves and the ways in which, you know, the problems of inequality hurt us. Anyways, Connie Converse, as I discussed in the very beginning of the book, of this video, was born in 1934, and you can also, was it 1934 or was it earlier? 1924, and you can consider Connie Converse being born 10 years before Joan Didion and Sylvia Plath, and wonder, like, had she been born 10 years earlier, would things have been better? Would she have been able to have achieved some level of success? Because when you really look at the four women that I discussed in this video, in this very roundabout capacity, Connie Converse, Joan Didion, Sylvia Plath, Babitz, who actually achieved success? Joan Didion achieved success within her lifetime because she was a careerist. She was really ambitious and single-handedly focused on her career, which isn't to say that the other women also weren't, but I do think that there is a way that Joan Didion was able to work within the expectations of society to help, I'm really using my hands a lot today, to really help grow her career. And Sylvia Plath, a lot of her success really did come towards after her suicide. Babitz's success came very late in life. She tried so hard at so many different artistic endeavors, and writing was probably her passion, but one that some may argue, and there is a line in the book from Babitz's sister where she says that it might just be that Slow Days, Fast Company was Babitz's best book, and that is okay. All of which is to say that if you're interested in thinking about how much time and place affects a person, like looking at these four women, it is clear to see that sometimes it does seem as if right time, wrong place. That's not how that goes, but you know what I mean. Anyways, I've really so all over the place today. I'm sorry. There's kids outside. They're trying to see if another kid will be able to play with them. Connie Converse was born in 1924 in New Hampshire in a family that was very religious, very strict. She comes from a long line of Americans. The author of this book is able to trace her genealogy to the early days of like American settlers and really consider the ways in which this through line really affected her upbringing, such that it did make it hard for her to form some relationships with people. And she was born at this time, she's quite well educated, but she also is really, she's so smart, and also someone who makes a decision that puts her at odds with the expectations of her family and of society at large. She goes to college and doesn't graduate. She decides to, someone was on the lawn, one of the kids. She decides to drop out of school, and this really upsets her mother. And the author makes a point of saying that she dropped out of school. She disappeared for 9 months. We don't know where she was. 9 months. He mentions 9 months, but I don't know if he makes this leap. I personally thought that maybe she could have been pregnant during that time. There could have been a child. And that hypothesis he does not explore at all, but it is one that I think that is very feasible. And you're seeing the ways that this woman is trying to build a life for herself. I have not told you what she's good at. She is basically an incredible musician. On top of being an incredible musician, she spoke Russian, she spoke French, she was working on an opera, she could play multiple instruments, she had a crazy smart mind, she was really forward thinking when it comes to peace policy, I don't know, she did something with that. There's a lot happening with this woman's life. What she ends up doing is that initially, when she was in high school, she wanted to be a writer, but then college days, or post-college, her best friend from high school commits suicide in a way that is really, Anyways, most likely as a testament to her friendship with this woman and this woman's incredible talent, because she herself was a musician, Connie Converse decides to put aside her hopes of being an author and instead focus her attention on music. And so she's living in Greenwich Village, she's by herself, she's living her life, and she is developing these songs that are so unique for their time, yet when you listen to them now, they feel very like timeless, but also like they could be so modern because there's this pathos and this interesting melodies, and the lyrical wordplay and the layers within the songs is quite fascinating. And so she was trying to establish a career for herself. She was hanging out with artists, like she would go to these parties and play for them, but she seems as if she was so secretive, that there's so much that we don't know about relationships with men she may have had or with women. Like there's so much we don't know, but the author does such a great job of creating a story of her life, like giving us enough. There is enough, because Connie Converse also was really intense about saving and archiving her life. So she gave her brother, I didn't even tell you the whole entire story, like the ways in which you really hook someone with this. Connie Converse was a musician in the 50s who disappears at the age of like 50, disappears completely, packs everything in her car in Michigan and is like, I gotta go, see you guys later. No one hears from her ever again. That is the mystery of Connie Converse. The author is giving us her whole entire life story and trying to explain where she might have gone, what happened, what may have led to this decision, and everything like that. But I am just like so, I don't know, I was just so like taken with her life and the possibility of all the talent that we don't see in this life, that I just, whatever, you know. I would really recommend this book. Do it on audiobook, because the author will play the actual songs of Connie Converse, and you will like analyze the lyrics, and you will look at her familial relationships, the various career things that she did and tried, and how she ultimately came to the decision to put music behind her and move to Michigan. And she had a career there, and she was really invested in the community in Ann Arbor, and really involved with the college scene, and was at the forefront of a lot of, you know, civil rights movements. But then she gets disheartened and things take a turn for the worse. So check out that book. Thank you so much for listening to my various monologues. Okay, the last 3 books that I read in the month of July were all for Booker. Shout out those leaks, because they really helped me get a leg up on the reading. The first book that I read was Headshot by Rita Bullwinkel. This is, if you're sports inclined, maybe this book will be for you. I'm not particularly sports inclined. I didn't really get on with this. I think that if you wanted to, I don't want to also talk too much because I have to give my Booker reviews. Anyways, Headshot is a story of female, they're not wrestlers, they're boxers. And so it's a really important day because it is the national champion finale, whatever's happening, and there's going to be like 6 to 8 fights. And so we start off with 2 of the girls fighting, and the narrator is looking at the fight and kind of comparing them, and then going on to the next fight, and onward until we get to a final winner. And I wish that this novel had been shorter or longer. Instead, it's kind of just like this very awkward, short-ish length in which there's a lot of repetition, and we get this idea of the main idea is to really consider the ways in which these women, these young women, and at this point is stressed quite a bit, is that they are unable to vote, they can't enter the army yet, or drink or smoke, whatever, yet they are killing machines because they have trained their body to do this, and to consider the ways in which the female form, one that is often considered so dainty, is now a killing machine. Like, that is one of the ideas that we're working with. We're also considering a kind of collective consciousness and the ways in which we are dipping in and out of their heads. Those are the themes. If you want to hear more, go check out my Booker video whenever that comes up. The next book that I read was Hold by Anna Michaels. This is a fragmentary story of kind of like, I don't know, a generation of family, but it's hard to really say that because we don't focus with the same family. Like, these random other characters show up towards the end, and some people said this book was beautiful. I don't necessarily think that. I do think that there were moments that I was kind of taken with the language, but as a whole, this needed another edit. This is looking at the idea of like the bonds that hold us, and not just the familial and relationship bonds, but also the ways in which cloth holds us. Very early on, we read about how I think Irish fishermen and the various sweaters that they would wear, that their wives and mothers and sisters would knit for them, and how that was important. It could signify the village that he came from and whether or not he was living or dead. And this kind of through line is continued throughout the novel. There's also the inclusion of a ghost, that situation that is introduced and then completely dropped and forgotten about. Yeah, that was interesting. Then the final book that I read was a real winner. I really enjoyed this book. That book that I'm going to discuss is The Safekeep, and this is sapphic desire, yearning, but also kind of looking at displacement. Not kind of, it is looking at displacement and the ways in which some people benefit and the lies that they tell themselves in order to think and feel that everything is okay even though they have done something wrong. And then to also look at the kind of rage that happens when you are displaced and things are taken from you forcefully. Yeah, okay. I have to say, if you made it this far, thank you so much. I don't feel the most confident about this video, but I do know I had a great reading month. I mentally, like, my brain was working a lot and connecting ideas and thinking about ideas and realizing things, and we all know it's really important to be realizing things. Cue Kylie Jenner. But I don't think that this may have been my best video, and for that I really appreciate you sticking through with it and watching my videos. I think the next one shall be better. You just have to, I don't know, try again and all that jazz and get used to it. Anyways, thank you so much. I will see you in the next video.